Okay, welcome everyone to another AML Gray Matters broadcast. Today is the 21st of June, 2023. Happy summer solstice, everyone. It's the longest day of the year. And we are here with Justine Plankowitz of Claritas Compliance in the Cayman Islands, and we're going to be discussing business risk assessments. Before we begin, a little bit of housekeeping. Now, today's webinar should not be considered legal advice. We do encourage our listeners to seek counsel appropriate in your jurisdiction and for your industry where necessary. Now, I reviewed the slides that Justine prepared over the weekend, and being based in Cayman, there are sections that she is going to be referring to Cayman supervisors and their findings and reporting of weaknesses. However, those same findings are likely reported by other regulatory bodies. So even if you are not in Cayman, there are some great lessons here for everyone. And for the record, we have registrants from 82 different countries, from Panama to Pakistan. And from what I've seen in the slides, there are takeaways in the session for everyone. Now, we do anticipate today's webinar to take about 1 hour. I also encourage you to post questions, and I'll do my best to post your questions to Justine at the end. We do have over 1,000 people signed up, and I'm looking, we have over 300 people in the live session right now. So I may not be able to get to all the questions, but I will make a point of reviewing your questions and posing the most relevant and addressing any I can't get to in the post-webinar follow-up email. And certificates of attendance will be auto-generated to live attendees only. We'll send out the recording in a couple of days. Those usually go out on Fridays or early the following week. And we'll send that out by email, and there will be instructions on how to get a copy of the slides in that email. But before we begin, I do have a polling question for our live audience. So Tom, if you don't mind launching that polling question. And the question is, have you been made responsible for drafting your organization's business risk assessment? Now, I remember drafting my first one over 15 years ago, and it was a significantly large task. And since then, I've assisted with a few smaller businesses, and it does take a lot of digging into the business's customer base, their processes, systems that they use, how they interact with their clients or customers. It's not a quick exercise at all. It can take days to wrap your head around it, and I'm glad, Justine, you are here today to help our listeners understand better this aspect of our AML compliance obligations. In fact, Justine, just reviewing the slides you sent over, I've already seen some areas where my own drafting can be improved. Specifically, you're going to be pointing out a pitfall of not referring to a country's national risk assessment, and that was actually going to be one of my questions, if we should be referring to the NRAs when drafting a risk assessment. So I'm glad you added that in your slides, or you have that in your slides. And I look forward to seeing what you have to say about that later on. Tom, how's our polls looking right now? Okay, I'm looking at the responses, and I'm seeing 21% of you are saying yes, you have to write your business risk assessment from scratch. 23% of you are saying yes, you have a previous draft as a starting point. 12% of you are here just for the managerial oversight responsibility, and 43%, nope, you do not have to write it, you're just here to learn more. That said, you're probably going to get some training, because that's something else that Justine mentions, is that we're supposed to be doing some staff training on these business risk assessments as well. Moving on to the next slide. Justine, it's up to you to kind of take it from here. And again, thank you very much for your time today and for doing this for us. I know this is a pretty big deal that's often overlooked. And you mentioned earlier when we were just talking kind of before we got online, that most businesses you see do have one, but they are lacking. Is that correct?
That's right. Thanks, Kimberly. Yeah, most of the business risk assessments I have seen in the area of AML CFT suffer from more than one deficiency. So hopefully, when I take you through the material today, and when you have time to review the slides later on at your leisure, hopefully the tips that I give you today will help you not make the same mistakes that I've seen out in the field.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, when I was going through your slides, I was like, yeah, there's there's a lot here that I know that whenever I've written things in the past that I could definitely improve on. So I'll let you just take it from here. And Justine, I won't interrupt you with any questions, but I am going to be watching the questions that are posted, and I will save those for the end, so I don't kind of mess up any flow that you have. And just tell me when I need to move on to the next slide.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I wanted to talk first about the international standards that relate to carrying out these AML CFT risk assessments. Then we'll move on to some of the basics of what is an AML CFT risk assessment and what you actually have to assess. What are the risks and what are the different risk factors? We will look at some of the findings that regulators have made in relation to enterprise-wide risk assessments in the course of their on-site inspections. And also I've put together a list of 10 pitfalls to avoid. And then, because it's a question that comes up very often, what do you do, how do you do your risk assessment if you are an entity, one of many entities in a group setting? So we're talking about risk assessments at the group level versus risk assessments at the individual level. So let's get started with international standards. Most of you would know that the Financial Action Task Force is the international standard setter for money laundering, terrorist financing, proliferation financing, financial crime standards. Most countries in the world are members of either the Financial Action Task Force or a FATF-style regional body. And the FATF standards, as we call them, they consist of 40 recommendations, which means 40 recommendations about what needs to be in legislation, as well as immediate outcomes, which seek to determine how well a country does at applying their laws and regulations relating to AML CFT. Now, it's important to note that FATF standards are not law, so they don't have force of law in any jurisdiction. So therefore, you can't look to the FATF standards to see what you have to do in terms of what your obligations are. But there are peer reviews of countries to ensure that countries implement the FATF standards fully and effectively. And this peer review process holds countries to account where they're not compliant with those 40 recommendations and 11 immediate outcomes. So therefore, I wanted to bring these FATF standards to your attention, those that relate to risk assessments, because if you are looking for more context about what is in your AML regulations or requirements in your own country, you can always go back to the FATF standards and see what the philosophy was behind some of these requirements. So if we could have the next slide, we'll move on to recommendation 1. So as I mentioned, there's 40 recommendations, and the very first recommendation states that countries would require financial institutions and designated non-financial businesses and professions. And for those of you who are familiar with AML CFT, you would know that designated non-financial businesses and professions, or DNFBPs for short, consists of, for example, lawyers and accountants, real estate agents, dealers in precious metals and stones, and casinos, and so on. So financial institutions and DNFBPs in every country should be required to identify, assess, and take action to mitigate their money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing risks. Now, most of the 40 recommendations also have interpretative notes that are you can find these online as well. And it basically, the interpretative note to recommendation 1 says that financial institutions and DNFBPs should have in place processes to identify, assess, monitor, manage, and mitigate money laundering and terrorist financing risks. And it says that the general principle of a risk-based approach is that if there are higher risks, financial institutions and DNFBPs should take enhanced measures to manage and mitigate those risks. So moving on to the immediate outcomes, there is, on the effectiveness side, some of the questions that are asked of countries when they are being assessed is how well do financial institutions, DNFBPs, and virtual asset service providers, or VASPs, how well do they understand their money laundering and terrorist financing risks and their AML CFT obligations? And then on a related note, they also ask how well do financial institutions and DNFBPs apply mitigating measures commensurate to those VASPs. So you'll see that's reflected in our anti-money laundering regulations here in the Cayman Islands, which in Regulation 5, so as you know, Regulation 5 is the regulation that describes all of the policies and procedures that financial institutions and DNFBPs must have in place. And you'll see in Regulation 5, it says that these policies and procedures must have regard to the money laundering and terrorist financing risks and the size of the financial services business. So having a proper understanding of risks allows you as a financial service provider to apply the risk-based approach. And the risk-based approach is really at the heart of AML CFT compliance. The risk-based approach basically says that you have to allocate more attention and more resources to areas of higher risk. And those resources could be money, it could be human resources, or it could, for example, be IT. So you see that risk understanding really is the foundation of a solid AML, CFT, and counterproliferation financing program. If you do not understand your AML, CFT, CPF risks, you might not catch your risk exposures. You might not be able to properly identify instances of money laundering and terrorist financing because you will not allocate the resources to the areas where those risks are most present. So it's really important to make sure that that everyone understands their risks. And so this is why the risk assessment is enshrined in regulations and in the international standards. So when we talk about risk assessment, what is the expectation? In our anti-money laundering regulation, Regulation 8 in the Cayman Islands, the risk factors that every financial services business must assess are listed. These are the same as the ones that are in the FATF international standards. So no matter where you are in the world, you will have some kind of version of these risk factors that you must assess. So there's 4 customers, so the risk exposures coming from your customers, geographical exposures, product, services, and transactions, and delivery channels. And delivery channels is just another way of saying the risks that are present in the way that you choose to onboard your customers and in the way that you communicate with your customers on an ongoing basis. And I will go through each one of these risk factors so that you'll know what types of considerations are relevant to each. So firstly, we have customers. So you would consider, when you assess the risk factor from your customers, you would consider first of all, your customer types. Are they natural persons? Are they local companies? Are they international companies? Are they trusts? Are they politically exposed persons? You would know that different types of customers, even between different types of companies, for example, carry a different risk profile. And this is something that you will find in your national risk assessment, as well as in publications, for example, from the FATF or from FATF-style regional bodies. In the Cayman Islands, for example, we know that trusts are inherently a high-risk type of customer. It doesn't mean that all your customers that are trusts are high risk, but it means that when you assess customer type, all the trusts will be high risk. We also know about politically exposed persons that are naturally high risk as well. And then depending on your own risk assessment in your country, different types of customers, as I mentioned, could have a different risk profile ascribed to them. You also look at number of customers overall, because the premise is that if you have more customers overall, you have higher risk exposures, right? Statistically speaking. You also look at the number of customers of each type. So again, if you have more of a low risk type of customer, you'll probably have a lesser risk exposure than if you have more high risk customers. You look at the industries in which your customers are operating. We do have lists of high risk industries. And so some examples of these industries that are high risk are mining, import export, cryptocurrencies, gambling, and cash intensive businesses. And this is not a complete list. This is something that you would have to research. You would have to see what your own country views as being higher risk industries, but these are just some examples. So obviously, if you have more customers in high risk industries, your risk exposure will increase. And then you also look at the complexity of your customers. So a simple local business versus a multinational corporation with branches and subsidiaries all over the world. Now, on this slide, what I'm hoping that you can also gather is that in order to be able to do this risk assessment properly, you really have to know your customer, right? So it all goes back to being able to do proper and thorough customer due diligence at the outset, so that you really know your customer base and you're able to then risk assess this factor in your risk assessment. So next we come on to geographical exposures. So you should look at the numbers and types of customers from each country. Again, we know that some countries pose more risks of money laundering and terrorist financing, and some countries are lower risk or higher risk. In our country, so in our regulation, Regulation 8A in the Cayman Islands says that every financial services provider must carry out their own country risk. And you assess country risk using basically credible sources, open source materials, right? So you look at the risk of corruption, the risk of criminality, the risk of money laundering, and so on. So you have to do open source research on the countries where your customers come from. It also says that some countries can never be low risk, and those are countries that, for example, don't have effective AML CFT systems, they have high levels of corruption, obviously if they're subject to sanctions, if they have been identified as high risk by FATF. High risk, so you know that FATF has a blacklist and a gray list. The countries on the blacklist should not be low risk countries. It does not apply to the countries that are on the gray list, or countries where countermeasures have been imposed by cabinet in the Cayman Islands, and currently there are no such countries. Next slide, please. So the next risk factor that you look at is the risk in the product, services, and transactions that you offer. So you have to look at your own business model. What types of products and services are offered to customers, and which ones are more utilized versus less utilized? Then when you look at those particular products and services that are most utilized, what is the view of the risk of money laundering, terrorist financing, proliferation financing through the use of this type of product? And in order to make that kind of assessment, you can look at, again, your national risk assessment, sector risk assessments issued by your supervisor, and sometimes also the FATF or another international organization will put out a study or typology report or research study survey on the types of risks with various products. So again, this requires open source research to be able to have an educated view about the level of risk in each of the products you're offering. Now, when it comes to transactions, you're going to be looking at your transaction volume and your transaction value. Again, with the premise that the more transactions you do, the higher the risk of a transaction being misused for money laundering, terrorist financing, or proliferation financing. And you also look at the risk of the countries where the transactions originate. For example, if you are the recipient of those transactions, or where those transactions are going to. And again, if you have many transactions that are going to higher risk countries, that will pose obviously a higher risk. Next slide, please. So the fourth risk factor that I had on my list from before is the risk associated with delivery channels. How do you onboard customers? And usually we see that customers are onboarded either face-to-face. So your customer comes into your branch or your office, they fill out the paperwork, they meet with someone. They can be onboarded over an internet platform, or they can, for example, be onboarded through eligible introducers. And those introducers could be within the group or outside of your corporate group. Obviously, some of these methods carry more AML, TF risks than others. So any delivery channel that allows for more anonymity will be riskier than those that allow face-to-face contact. So again, you have to have the statistics in your company to determine which one of these methods is most used. Right? So are you onboarding most of your customers over the internet, which would pose a higher risk exposure to money laundering and terrorist financing, or do you meet your customers face-to-face? The other thing to remember is that sometimes you can have a blended approach whereby maybe you onboard your customer over the internet, but you still meet them face-to-face on a quarterly basis, for example, for meetings or so on, or you onboard them over the internet, but you do a video call face-to-face. So obviously, it's not quite as simple as just one or the other. So, so you really have to look at what is your company doing, how are they doing it, and what is the risk associated with that delivery channel. Now, one thing to remember is that in the olden days, I want to say pre-COVID, there was always this perception that remote onboarding and long distance onboarding were higher risk delivery channels. Obviously, a lot changed during COVID. There's been a lot of new platforms that allow remote onboarding. There's very reliable video calls, and people basically have found methods that work in relation to remote onboarding and eKYC. And so this is slowly starting to be recognized by regulators, and including in the Cayman Islands. So our guidance notes are being amended to state that remote onboarding will no longer automatically be higher risk. It can still be higher risk depending on the circumstances, but that it's not always the case because there are reliable substitutes for basically for face-to-face onboarding. So this is basically to note that it's not a shortcut that you can take anymore to say, well, it's always remote, therefore it's always high risk. It's a bit more nuanced than that now. So I said that there was four risk factors that you should examine when you do your business risk assessment. However, I always like to include a fifth one. It's not mandated, but I think that it provides good context on what the level of risk and the level of control should be in your business. And so this bonus risk factor, I have it on the slide here, and it has to do with the nature, size, and complexity of your own business. So how large and complex is your business? Are you a small local company? Are you large and cross-border? How many employees do you have? Again, the employee question could go both ways. So if you have many employees, obviously that increases the need for more internal controls to make sure that your employees are there's no malfeasance from your employees, or if you don't have enough employees, that means that, for example, you don't have enough compliance resources, and that can pose a risk itself. How big, how many assets under management do you have, or annual turnover? Again, the more sales you do, the more customers you have, again, that increases your risk statistically. And then the final question is, what was the risk rating assigned to your sector in the national risk assessment or your sector risk assessment? Again, it does not mean that your own business automatically takes on that risk profile. So for example, if you are a securities investment business, it does not, and the NRA classed you as medium high risk, it does not necessarily mean that your business is automatically high risk, but you need to go look in the NRA to see why your sector was rated the rating that they gave, and you need to consider how your business differs, if at all, from what's in the NRA. Okay, next slide. So this risk assessment, we've gone through the factors, as I mentioned, 4 factors: customers, geography, product, services, and transactions, delivery channels, as well as of the bonus one of your own nature, size, and complexity. So you have to assess those 4 factors, and you have to assess them separately with respect to money laundering, terrorist financing, and soon you'll have to assess them against your exposure to proliferation financing or breach of targeted financial sanctions relating to proliferation. Next slide, please. So it's really important that you analyze money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation separately. So they can all be part of one risk assessment, but they have to have their own separate sections. And I see this a lot where a company has done a risk assessment and they lumped in money laundering, terrorist financing, proliferation financing under one heading, and they say, oh, our risks for all three of these are low. And why this is not quite correct? Well, first of all, you have a different origin of funds. So you'll remember that money laundering always involves dirty money. So when you do your money laundering risk exposure, you have to consider where the money from your customers could come from. But terrorist financing and proliferation financing can be legitimately earned funds. There are different interests involved in respect to money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing. So money laundering, in a money laundering situation, the money launderer will seek to conceal the origin of the funds. Versus in proliferation financing and terrorist financing, the goal is to conceal the destination of where the funds are going to. There are, of course, different high-risk countries, so it's not the same for money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing. They all have different lists of high-risk countries that you have to look at. And then there's different aims. Basically, money laundering is circular, so the money, it would always go back to the perpetrator of the criminal offense in some kind of roundabout way, versus terrorist financing and proliferation financing are linear. They go from the funder to a recipient, maybe with some stops and deviations in between, but it basically goes from A to B. And versus for money laundering, it would go from A to A. Next slide, please. So the other requirements in our regulations in the Cayman Islands is that the risk assessment must be documented. So you must have a document that shows the risks that you've considered, how you assess those risks, and your conclusions on the risk. The risk assessment must be kept current. So your document should contain the next date of review of the risk assessment. It can be, this is risk-based. So some companies do it annually, some bigger companies especially will do it annually, versus some smaller, more stable companies will do it every 3 years. It's up to you and your company. You need to document, obviously, the rationale for why you've chosen that particular cycle. However, in some instances, the risk assessment might need to be updated between those regular annual or every 2 year, every 3 year reviews. And these are trigger events. For example, if you expand into a new market, if you launch a new product, the risk assessment should be reviewed. And so those trigger events that would cause you to review a risk assessment should also be in your documentation. You need to consider in your documented risk assessment all relevant risk factors and all the mitigants. And by mitigants, we mean the solutions or controls that you have implemented to control your risks. The risk assessment should be approved by your board of directors. It has to be consistent with the national risk assessment in the Cayman Islands, and where there are differences, those differences should be explained. So again, like I mentioned before, you don't automatically take on your sector risk rating from the national risk assessment, but you do have to see how your business differs from what's described in the national risk assessment. And if there's deviations, especially if you think you're lower risk, that should be explained in your documentation. And finally, there should be, your risk assessment should be a part of the training that's given to your staff on an annual basis or every couple of years, depending on how often it is reviewed. So let's go and see now some comments made by regulators when they were reviewing risk assessments during on-site inspection. So for the Cayman Islands Monetary Authority, I have picked up a on-site inspection, so thematic on-site inspection report from on-site inspections of registered persons. So it says that 42% of the registered persons that were inspected show weaknesses in their assessment of risks. Specifically, what was lacking is a documented overall business risk assessment that considered all of the relevant risks relative to the registered person structure and business activities. The risk assessment also lacked a documented methodology that explains the process of how you implement your risk assessment in accordance with the risk. Okay, next slide, please. So, Seema said that when you apply your risk-based approach, when you use the risk-based approach, you need to have a system and a methodology for to carry out the risk assessment, and including how you assess your anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing risks. You must detail how you will implement specific controls in relation to those risks. You must explain how you monitor and improve the effectiveness of your systems and procedures, and how you will report to senior management and the board of directors on the results of the risk assessments and the implementation of those controls. So next slide, please. So then next we have a compendium of on-site inspection findings from CIPA, which is the regulator for the accounting profession in the Cayman Islands. And it's based, and CIPA stands for the Cayman Islands Institute of Professional Accountants. So CIPA said that there was a failure in some cases to use data from within the firms or other information available from various assessments or other supervisors or Cayman Islands government relating to inherent risks. So again, this is really important. I keep mentioning this, that you need to base your view of risks on external data that is, or external information that is available, including a national risk assessment, including sector risk assessment, including publications, for example, from international standard setters. So your view of risk must be consistent. It doesn't mean the same, but it must be consistent with that information that is available to you. The other really important thing to note here is that you have to use data from within your firm. I see a lot of risk assessments that say, you know, some of our customers are high risk, and this tells me absolutely nothing. So it's a really good practice to be able to quantify the different risk elements and risk factors and considerations when you do the risk assessment. CIPA also found, as I mentioned before, that firms had failed to consider money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing risks specifically and separately, and to separately assess them in relation to the four risk factors, namely client, services provided, geography, and delivery channels. And then the other big finding was that the risk assessments were not dated, and there was no date in the risk assessment for the next review of the risk assessment. So now moving on to on-site inspections carried out by the Cayman Attorney Regulation Authority, so the regulatory body for lawyers in the Cayman Islands. So CARA actually did a thematic review of business risk assessments of law firms and published a document summarizing their conclusions. And this document is available on the CARA website. And it's actually, I found it very helpful, very comprehensive, and very clear. So if you do need more guidance, or if you're curious to see the details of the findings that I'm about to present, I strongly suggest that you go and look at the CARA report. Even though the CARA obviously regulates law firms, the findings that it makes in a lot of cases can translate to other types of financial institutions and DNVPs. Okay, so the first finding is that they thought that a lot of risk assessments did not consider the inherent risks, and that did not consider all relevant risk factors. So we had talked about the 4 risk factors that need to be considered. All of them need to be considered in relation to inherent risk as well as residual risk. The second finding was that the risk assessment did not provide any scores or ratings for the effectiveness of controls. So in a risk assessment, as I showed earlier, yes, you need to assess all your relevant risk factors, but you also need to look at the controls that you have to mitigate those risks. And those controls, you should also assess the effectiveness of the controls that you're planning on implementing. In some cases, CARA found that the control risk score did not justify the residual risk rating. So for example, if you thought that your controls were weak, that likely would not decrease your inherent risk rating. And in some cases, CARA found that firms were just putting down a generic control and then saying that it decreased their risk rating. So this really has to be thought through when you do your risk assessment. So you have your inherent risk. What is the nature of that inherent risk? And is this control that we're talking about, how well are we implementing this control, and is it really targeted to the risk? And then on a related note, the other finding was that a lot of times the business risk assessment did not refer to a firm's specific controls, but it actually used generic controls. So for example, it said, we do customer due diligence, and that's not enough. You have to look at the controls that you have within your firm. Now, CARA also highlighted some good practices amongst its firms. And so some good practices, so these are not, this is not part of what's required in the anti-money laundering regulations, but it makes your risk assessment more complete, comprehensive, and easy to justify to regulators. So good practices, some good practices are to describe your source of data and information. So what did you use to carry out your risk assessment? The period of data analyzed, so are you looking on a monthly basis? Are you looking on an annual basis, every 2 years, and so on? How did you test the effectiveness of controls? So again, it's not enough to say you have a generic control. You should provide a description of the procedure that you use to assess the effectiveness of that control. It's a good idea to state who was involved in carrying out this risk assessment. So whether it was the AML CO, some other compliance staff, management, other employees, or even outsourced service providers. And the other good practice was to describe the procedures in place in the firm to monitor and to update the risk assessment. And we had talked about that earlier. The review should be risk-based. So depending on your risk, you should set a period of time where you will review the business risk assessment, but with the caveat that sometimes things could happen that would cause your business risk assessment to not be accurate anymore, and it might need to be reviewed outside of those timelines. And then CARA also said something that I find really interesting and that very true, and that some firms might shy away from. But CARA said and acknowledged that a business risk assessment will never result in zero risks. And I completely agree with that. It's impossible when you are a financial services provider, when you're a DNFBP, it's impossible to have zero money laundering, terrorist financing, proliferation financing risks. You would just not be in business. So then CARA continues that, on the other hand, the business risk assessment should determine a high level of inherent risk should not be necessary. It's not necessarily a negative thing. And it's not, it shouldn't be perceived in a way that suggests the firm ought to consider de-risking. Rather, when you find that you have an inherent risk, a high inherent risk, you should, A, find a way to control the risk and control it to a level that is within your firm's risk appetite, right? So a high inherent risk, not necessarily always bad, as long as it is controlled, as long as the firm is aware about it, and as long as they are comfortable with it. So based on all of this, what I had just presented from the different regulators, from the international standards, from what's in the AMLRs, I want to take you through 10 mistakes that I often see firms make in their MLTF risk assessment. One of them is that a lot of firms consider only money laundering and not terrorist financing. And we had talked about that earlier, in that you have to consider money laundering, terrorist financing, and soon proliferation financing. And these are all separate assessments. They can be part of one document, but they must be assessed separately. Which leads me to the second mistake, is that a lot of firms assess money laundering and terrorist financing risk as part of one risk. So they say, you know, for money laundering and terrorist financing, our customer risk is low. And that is a mistake, because as we saw, there are too many differences between money laundering and terrorist financing, how they work, to be able to lump them together. The third mistake, again, we had talked about earlier, is that it's not quantitative or based on actual data. It's good to have qualitative data or qualitative information that you can use in your risk assessment, but it's a really, really good idea to have data from your actual business. How many customers do you have? How many PEPs do you have? Where do those customers, how much come from high-risk countries? You know, how many of your customers utilize your most high-risk products? That will give you a much more accurate idea of your risk in your business, rather than saying most of our customers are from lowest risk countries. That tells you nothing. Which leads me to the fourth mistake, which is related, using generalization. So a lot of risk assessments I saw will say, for example, we'll have sentences like, our trust business is low risk because we have good controls. Or saying we implement customer due diligence like it's required in the money laundering regulations. Again, it has to be specific to your own business, using data and using external sources of information. Which leads me to number 5, which is not referring to the national risk assessment or your supervisory sector risk assessment. So I have seen risk assessments where the conclusions on a firm's level of risk were so far from the national risk assessment or the supervisory sector risk assessment that was published by the supervisor that it would have been very difficult to explain to your regulator, well, why did you think that your risk is so low when the national risk assessment says that your risk is high? So again, it doesn't need to be, you don't need to have the exact same risk assessment as are in the NRA or your sector risk assessment, but where there are deviations, you need to consider why the NRA assessed it a certain way, how are you different, and so therefore justify your own risk rating. Number 6. A lot of risk assessments confuse inherent risk with residual risk. So you need to start by assessing your inherent risk for each of these 4 risk factors. Inherent risk is the risk that comes from your business before you apply any controls to it. So it is your raw risk. The residual risk is your risk that's left over after you apply your controls. As per number 7, those controls, the strength or effectiveness of those controls or mitigants that you apply to your inherent risk should be assessed. And that should be obvious within your documentation. The next 3 mistakes that people make are actually something that happens after you've done your risk assessment. So one is that you do not adapt. So you have the risk assessment and then it just sits on the shelf and you've done it because you've done it and that's the end of it. But actually you need to then go back. Once you've done your risk assessment, you need to go back to see, okay, which areas of the risk assessment are less controlled, which areas might need a correction, for example, in policies and procedures, which areas might need a little bit more for us to be able to control that risk. So your policy and procedures should be adapted to the risk assessment. The other mistake is not updating your risk assessment upon a trigger event. Again, as I mentioned, it should be updated frequently or regularly, I'm sorry, not necessarily frequently, regularly, or upon the crystallization of a trigger event, for example, a new line of business or any new emerging risk that you see. And then the 10th mistake is not explaining in your methodology how you assess your risk or your controls. So I have seen, for example, risk assessments that it's just a spreadsheet and it says customer risk, high, controls, good, residual risk, low, and that was the end of it. And that is not sufficient for you to be able to really understand where your risks are coming from. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit for the last few slides, we've had questions about how do you carry out a risk assessment when you're part of a group? So the CIMA guidance notes state that your risk assessment should be appropriate for your particular organization structure and business activities. And it says that where appropriate and feasible, the risk-based approach should be articulated on a group-wide basis. Now, of course, the million-dollar question is, when is it appropriate and feasible? So next slide, please. So in my view, and this is just my view, this is not in the guidance notes, but this is from my experience, it is most appropriate when the Cayman entity and the other members of the group are fairly similar. So they have similar sizes, similar products and services offerings. They have maybe similar external risk exposures, for example, country risk or customers, and where they comply with controls that are at least as stringent as those required in the Cayman Islands. In this case, it might be appropriate to have a true group level risk assessment. When you document, if you choose to go that way, the risk assessment should still be sufficiently granular and specific to make sure that they reflect the risks of the Cayman entity. So what happens in a lot of cases that the Cayman entity is a very, very small piece of a very large multinational group. And so the risks of the Cayman entity get lost in this risk assessment that is conducted at the group level. And so the risk assessment in the narrative should also sufficiently reflect those risks that are specific to the Cayman entity. So there are a couple of options. These are not all of the options, obviously, that are on the table. And because this is a very high-level presentation, I just wanted to get your give you some food for thought here with these options. Obviously, the consideration of how you do it will be a lot more scientific than this, and a lot more might go into it. But generally, a couple of options. So if you think that a purely group-wide risk assessment is appropriate, so as I mentioned, if the entities in the group are similar sizes, similar risk factors, you can add up your risk exposure from every entity, or you can assign different weightings to different entities or to specific risk factors to reflect any areas of higher risk. And then you can make specific mentions for any outliers. So that's kind of an option where everything is grouped together. And then you have a couple of methods of bringing out some anomalies or some higher risks or some outliers. And then the other option is that each entity within a particular group carries out their own risk assessment. So this is more appropriate when the entities are different sizes, different products and services, and so on. So all entities within the group carry out their own entity level risk assessment using the same methodology. Now, this is crucial if you want it to be a true group level risk assessment. The methodology should be the same across all entities. So these individual entities carry out their own risk assessment, and then risk assessments are all qualitatively aggregated, and I put aggregated in quotation marks because they're not really aggregated in terms of the numbers, but the messages and what stands out is aggregated to present a group-wide picture. However, the group-wide compliance function and the group-wide executive management would also see each individual entity's risk assessment separately. So they would know that, for this company in Cayman, the risks are this, but, their sister company in France, the risks are that. So then they can get a true picture of the different risks within each group with, as I mentioned, an aggregation or like a summary that brings out the risks that are common in the entire group. So in conclusion, some thoughts that I wanted to leave you with. First of all, a risk assessment is highly individual to each entity. It's very difficult to some people will try to do this. They'll ask their colleague in another firm, say, hey, can you send me your risk assessment, and we'll just change the name and change a couple of things, and it's going to be our risk assessment. Not advisable. So each risk assessment is so unique to each individual entity based on that entity's data, based on that entity's risk appetite, that it should be a custom product. Your risk assessment documentation must set out the methodology that you use to assess your risks and your controls. And it should explain why you've assessed the risks and controls a certain way. And then finally, in the case of groups, the overall approach will depend on the type of group and how the Cayman entity fits within the overall group.
Justine, thank you very, very much. I do have a few questions coming in, so I'm going to see if I can read through some of these. Oh gosh, let me just start with the top here. That's a lot of information, by the way. And I actually do have a few questions of my own. So we're looking at, we got about 9 more minutes left. And one of the questions is, would you consider things, trigger events, to include things like global events that are going on in the world? I mean, of course, I bring up, Russia and Ukraine. That would be a trigger event in my mind for re-reviewing your business risk assessment. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if it's something that touches on, like, for example, if you know that you have customers in Russia, so for example, using the war in the Ukraine, like if you know you have customers in Russia, customers in the Ukraine, obviously that would be a trigger event for you, because it would change the risk that you are exposed to.
Okay. And you also mentioned about like the types of customers, and the only thing I would mention is things like the difference between high net worth customers and ultra high net worth customers versus regulated clients. I mean, we've got a lot of trust and company service providers on the call today, so I'm sure that they will be listening in and kind of thinking in terms of whenever they incorporate a company in their jurisdiction. And then of course, it will be not just the fact that the corporate client is their client, but who are the UBOs behind those. And that's, again, in my view, that would be what I'd be looking for, not just that, yeah, I've got, 200 Cayman entities as my client. It would be, I've got 200 Cayman entities, but then behind that, I have this percentage of ultra high net worth clients, and that are UBOs. Is that, and you understand, is that how you would do it as well?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think, there's a bit of a danger in presenting slides like this, because I wasn't able to list, everything that you would consider for your customer types, right? So I just picked out some examples, but absolutely, depending on the clients you have, you would need to dig a little bit deeper. When you have companies, yeah, who's behind the company, where when we talk even about geographical exposures, like you talk about, for example, for companies, where's the company incorporated, but you also would talk about, would assess where the UBOs of the company are based, right? That's also really important. So absolutely, this was kind of like an overview with some examples, but definitely you need to dig farther than what I was able to explain today.
Okay. And mentioned in slide, it was slide 24 and slide 25 under when you were talking about CARA's findings, you mentioned the testing of effectiveness of controls. Would you mind explaining a little bit more about how one would test their controls or the effectiveness of their controls?
Right. So, I mean, there's a few ways. So usually the compliance officer or an outsourced service provider would, for example, look to make sure that those controls are adhered to. So, for example, if you have controls relating to customer onboarding and you have let's say you have remote onboarding, and somebody instead of uploading a passport, how well, for example, your EKYC would be able to detect a fake passport, for example, or when you do your customer due diligence, when you enter the names into your system, like how good is your system that you're using at detecting, names of criminals. So, for example, you enter the name of a known criminal and see if that gets picked up. In terms of, like, if you do transaction monitoring, again, if you have an automated system, if you input some information that triggers some of the parameters, is your system picking it up? Sometimes you can also do some back testing. So, for example, if you have something that happened or that was suspicious, or that ended up being a problem, you go back and say, well, did our systems pick it up? And if not, why not? So there's different ways of testing your controls. Usually, the AML CO would look at some of those controls on an annual basis. And also, of course, when you do your AML audit, those controls will be tested.
Okay. I think that actually answered. I've been sitting here looking at some of the questions, and I've got a few people who are talking about, stress testing and how do you assess the control. So I think that possibly answered a lot of those questions that did come in. We are running up to the top of the hour here, so and I know a lot of people are on very limited time. We've got actually quite a few questions, so I can't pose them all to you. But what I'm going to do, if you don't mind, Justine, is I'll go through these and I'll send you an email with the questions, and then maybe between you and I, we can, whenever I do the webinar follow-up email, we can address some of these questions more specifically, because I think a lot of them would take another 5 minutes to answer each one. But thank you very much. I do appreciate that. And one thing that I was kind of mentioning before, I had written some business risk assessments for some smaller clients, and I was asking about that national risk assessment, and I had asked you before, like I was looking specifically at the real estate, property development industry in our sector in Cayman and their national risk assessment, and they were talking about the nature, size, and complexity, and they had that particular sector as high risk. And you kind of helped me understand that it didn't mean that the real estate industry is high risk. They were talking about the transactions and the fact that it's, international, a lot of international players are involved, in buying real estate, and the size of those transactions can be in the millions of dollars when they buy these condos and real estate. And again, do I have that correct? It doesn't necessarily mean that all property developers and real estate agents have to say, yes, we're high risk. They just say that they just have to acknowledge that the size of their transactions and the type of people they're dealing with are higher risk, and how they're kind of dealing with that.
Yeah, so I mean, they're definitely not. So this is kind of like, when you do the national risk assessment, you take a survey across all of your population, right? So it's kind of like, the analogy I like to say is like, to say, okay, in the world, most women are 5 feet 5 inches tall. Well, you're going to have, people who are taller and people who are shorter, right? So it's the same thing with this risk assessment. It says, okay, on average, kind of looking at the sector, it's a medium high risk rating or a high risk rating, but individually you can have a different risk profile, right? Because, like, for example, you can be a property developer that doesn't sell internationally and that just sells, like, low value condos to locals, and then so your risk profile will be completely different.
Right. Okay, great, thank you. And as far as like proliferation financing, because I've had a few people ask about proliferation financing, and correct me if I'm wrong, are you or is it Elizabeth, you're doing another webinar with us, I want to say in September, on proliferation financing, is that correct?
I think Elizabeth would be, yeah.
Okay, yeah, so for those of you who have the proliferation, because I know that's a big kind of focal point right now, proliferation financing, so please do join us for that, and you will get, everybody who's here today will get that invite. One final poll before we go, because we got 1 minute before we are finished here. And Tom, if you don't mind going ahead and releasing that poll, is do you have a better understanding of how to improve your business risk assessment, or at least where to start, or where you could be possibly going wrong, I guess, or what you need to add. Justine, I know if I was writing a business risk assessment today, I would definitely feel like I have a better understanding, and I especially know, for the things that I've done in the past, for those I've done in the past, I go, yeah, I could definitely go back and improve those. So right now it looks like we've got some really good feedback. I am showing 65% are saying yes, they now know how to improve. About 20% are saying they feel confident that their current risk assessment is sufficient. 6% say they need more assistance. No shame in that. There's definitely some businesses out there that I think are very complex, especially the multinationals, where yeah, definitely get some good assistance. And we talked, Justine, earlier as well. So you provide services to Cayman companies. So if there are any Cayman companies or multinationals with a Cayman branch, they can reach out to you. Is that correct? With help with their business risk assessment?
That's right. We'd be more than happy to. We do this a lot. for our clients. So definitely, if you have questions, if you need assistance, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Great, yeah. And here are your contact details. And I don't know, Tom, if you did launch that, feel free to launch that poll. But yeah, the final numbers there, 63% we're saying yes, they know how to improve. 6% were saying they need more help. 9% not applicable. So that's very good feedback. So thank you again for giving us your time and your expertise today, because I think this is definitely an area that needs a lot more work across the world. And again, for those of you who are asking, yes, slides will be made available. The recording will go out here either by Friday or early next week. And of course, there will be instructions to who to contact to get a copy of the slides. So do please keep an eye out for that as well. And again, Justine, just thank you very much. I do appreciate this. I know these slides take so much time, and you're providing it free, and so we really do appreciate your work and your expertise here in the compliance community. And for those of you who are joining, thank you again for joining us. Again, if you're attending live, you will get an auto-generated certificate of attendance. It'll go out in about 1 hour. And again, I'll be emailing that recording, and you'll get instructions on how to get to the slides. If you want to know more about Silo, or if you're interested in being a guest or a sponsor of future webinars, or if you have a request for us to cover a particular topic, please do reach out to me. And our next broadcast is scheduled for July 12th, and we'll be discussing virtual assets with Andy Carpenter. He's a senior regulatory consultant in the virtual assets and blockchain division of OJ in Jersey, Channel Islands. So please do look out for our email inviting you to that particular broadcast. And of course, then we have some more coming up too in September. I think August we're taking a break, but more in September and October as well. So again, thank you very, very much, Justine. Thank you to our audience for joining us. And I will be looking through the questions to see what we can address in the follow-up email that will go out with the recording in a few days. Justine, thank you very much. And until next time, I hope everyone stays safe and healthy and enjoys their summer solstice today.
Anti-money laundering compliance and customer and vendor onboarding involves multiple processes that must be done correctly and by the right people in the most efficient way. The tasks include gathering customer and vendor ID and verification documents, screening against sanctions and politically exposed persons lists, analyzing any reputational risk, periodic monitoring to assess any changes and updating due diligence, and staff training on money laundering, terrorist financing, bribery and corruption awareness and risks, as well as keeping them up to date on your policies and procedures and new regulatory requirements. In addition to the onboarding processes being strictly followed and documented, management must have access to critical compliance metrics and information to steer the company through regulatory waters and mitigate customer and other risks. With Silo Compliance System, these obligations become much more efficient. With Silo, your staff can enter the customer's information and upload due diligence documents and any other documents that you require. Key information entered about your customer automatically calculates a risk score, a calculation using a risk-based approach determined by you at initial implementation of Silo. In addition, if you have screening enabled, when the customer's name is first entered into Silo, the name is checked against sanctions, politically exposed persons lists, and adverse media. You'll see results of screening immediately and can review any potential hits right away. And with screening enabled, your customers and vendors are continuously monitored for any sanctions advisories, helping you get ahead of any potential reputational risks. No company is too small to benefit from using Silo. Even if your onboarding processes seem under control today, if one key staff member becomes unavailable or there is any increase in your customer portfolio, compliance with strict onboarding and review processes can quickly overwhelm a small company and put you at risk. Plus, implementing Silo can reduce the need to hire additional staff to manage compliance obligations and reduce your risk of non-compliance regulatory penalties and continued inspections. No one goes through an inspection or audit with great ease, but several users have reported that their inspections went more smoothly, and with Silo, they had improved outcomes. Reach out to us today to schedule a demo of Silo.